Hello and welcome everyone. I have a very interesting conversation lined up for you today with Frank Hoogerbeets of SSGEOS. The website is ssgeos.org. That is also his YouTube handle. Frank has been studying planetary geometry now for 11 years. Hello and welcome. And I'm very excited to talk to you because we have some very big, powerful alignments active in the sky right now, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, we have a quintuple conjunction or alignment coming up from the 6th to the 11th. It will produce 9 planetary alignments in total. And the last time that something similar happened, not the same thing, but something similar was in March, around March 25th, 27th. And then on the 28th, we had the big 7.7 in Myanmar. So these conjunctions, they are definitely something to look for.
Yeah, that was a Mercury and Venus inferior conjunction
Yeah.
back like March 22nd, 23rd. I was tracking that. As we do the same thing. We overlap a lot. And our history, brief as it is kind of interesting too. I'll touch on that in just a second. But I was looking at that, and we had the coronal hole on the sun with the open magnetic field connecting all 3 planets together. I was like, this has to
Yeah.
do something. It was transequatorial, which means that we're really getting hit. It was big, so we're going to be in it for a while. High speed solar wind. And then we had that first big earthquake of 2025, the 7.7 in Myanmar. It's like, boom, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I mean, it was very destructive for them, but it was interesting seeing it all play out in real time. And once you learn about the planetary stuff, the solar stuff, the Earth geophysical geologic things, you can just kind of put it together more
Yeah.
often than not.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you never know exactly how the planets and the moon influence Earth's crust. So, I mean, it really requires a larger fault section to have reached the tipping point. And if that's not the case, you may see some increased seismic activity, this typical burst of strong earthquakes in the high 5 or 6 magnitude range. But you can count on it with such powerful alignments. If there is a larger fault section that has reached the tipping point, then you have something like in Myanmar, the 7.7.
Yeah, so you've been studying planetary geometry, as you just told me, for 11 years now. What first got you into that?
Well, I've been interested in the planet since childhood. As a child, I looked at the planets, at the pictures, and I was really baffled by the beautiful pictures of Saturn with its red spot and the moon, its craters, and everything. So it's been my world since childhood, really. And later on, I wondered, asked myself, could the planets have influence on seismic activity? But that was somewhere in the 90s, I think, and there wasn't internet at the time, so I couldn't really do research on that. So I actually went into geometry and started sacred geometry, everything that there is to learn about geometry in the solar system, everything. And then in 2014, I think something amazing happened. It was in June, and on June 10th, or around June 10th, I remember and there were 2 X-class solar flares, but no large seismic activity. The only thing that we had a couple of days later was 6.5. But then on the 23rd, on the 23rd of June 2014, there was this sudden burst of large earthquakes. There were 3 in the South Pacific at the Kermadec Trench, and then 3 more in the north at the Aleutian Islands, peaking 7.9. It was a huge seismic increase all of a sudden. And then I really asked myself, where did that sudden energy come from that burst in 2 places at the same time, almost within 8 hours? And that's when I really looked at the planets for the first time. I started up Solar System Scope, and I just looked at the solar system from the North Pole. And then I saw, to my surprise, 3 alignments nearly converging with Earth, I think between Mars and Uranus as well. And I wondered, is that a coincidence? And from there, I started to do the research. I looked at large earthquakes in the past, and then looked at the planetary alignments at the time of these earthquakes. And to my amazement, like the biggest one on record in 1960, the 9.5, there were planetary alignments, and then in 1964 with the 9.2, there was an obvious quadruple alignment. And then I started to do the research for about 8 months, and then in April, I think 2015, I did my first little forecast on Facebook. I remember a little post there. And I said, well, from the 22nd to the 27th of April is probably going to be more critical. And then on the 25th, there was the 7.8 in Nepal. So then I knew I was on the right track. And that's how everything started.
Yeah, similar story for me. One of my first experiences was back in 2023 with the double sequence in Turkey, which also brought you quite a bit of sudden popularity because at this point you were making regular videos on planetary lunar geometry and also atmospheric anomalies and then forecasting potential locations. And like, what was it, like a couple days before you basically highlighted Turkey? And I think you were pretty close with your magnitude assessment as well. Like you weren't terribly far off. You know, anyone can say, hey, we got a magnitude 4 coming. It's like, they happen daily, folks. For some locations, they literally happen every day. But to say like magnitude 6 plus, magnitude 7 plus, you start to get it accurately. And then we had the 7.8 and the 7.5. I was in Egypt at the time, and I was checking the Schumann resonances and noticed 4 days before these very unusual energy signatures appear in the Schumann resonances based off of the data collected by the Space Observing System. And there's noise in that data at times and local atmospheric effects, but sometimes they pick up like really unusual Earth energy signals. And I didn't know what they were at the time because I was still kind of new to it. And then being in Aswan the day of the earthquake, I was like having these feverish symptoms at the exact moment the earthquake's rupture in Turkey, kind of nearby, not super close by, but I'm not in, let's say, the United States. And I don't know why I was feeling like that, but it wasn't like a flu or anything because within a couple hours after the earthquakes hit, which was early morning, right, like very early morning, I was fine. I was on a bus going to Abu Simbel, and all of a sudden I felt like totally fine again. And then that was obviously a big event. I did a search and then you popped up and we had like a very quick communication. And well, now here we are a couple, I guess 3 years later now, nearly 3 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you sent me an email, I think, at the time, and which prompted me to look at your channel, and you had about 5,000 followers, I think. And then just recently I checked again and it was over 500,000. And I thought something happened there.
Well, I started to do a lot of planetary geometry, at least incorporating that. So I started with the Schumann resonances, and then once you learn about that, it opens up all these other doorways into neurocognition, but also consciousness and geophysics and space weather, and also planets kind of just get wrapped up into that. And I started to notice these alignments as well. And yeah, I think your story from earlier of how you had the big X flares, we had the big earthquakes, and then you check the geometry. The three seem to converge together at a rate that is higher than just noise. There's like a signal there for sure. And you'll get alignment sometimes, and it doesn't result in anything. As you said, like the plates aren't really ready to have a big earthquake, I guess, and sometimes you get big solar flares without it, but just more often than not, there's this convergence that occurs.
Yeah, it's really about cycles and elements coming together. The one thing that I noticed early on in 2014 is that the like X flares and solar activity in general, that seems to charge the planets. And I see the planets very much like magnets, moving magnets around the sun, like let's say a generator, and then the sun is the armature. This is actually also mentioned, I think, who was it? John H. Nelson from the RCA in the 1940s and 50s. Maybe you heard of him. He compared a solar system to actually an electric generator, and with the planets as the moving magnets. And that sounds right somehow. And when they get charged by solar activity and then the planets line up in certain ways, that does something, and also to Earth's crust. Interestingly, a few years ago, there was another confirmation, is that the NASA recorded an earthquake on Mars, magnitude 4.7, not big, but it was unique. And that was the exact time that Mars was in an alignment with Mercury and Venus. And from my research, Mercury and Venus are the combination of the two. These are the key players.
Well, that's interesting. Nelson, yeah, I've read his book, Cosmic Patterns, and also some of his research. I mean, this guy was definitely onto something. If you look at some of his charts, I mean, he was figuring out the location of the nodal points for the planets, which now if you use like astronomical or astrological software, I'm like still figuring out how I can get those plotted because it's so niche to find where Jupiter's orbit intersects with the ecliptic plane. And it's ascending, it's descending nodes. And he was doing this all by hand and having great success with it because he shares a whole bunch of example charts of the geometry. And if you know how to read them heliocentrically, it's like, wow. He says Mercury is the activator. And then Venus, being about the same mass as Earth but close to the sun, has a strong influence over the sun. And there's evidence that that influences sunspot formation, solar activity, certain resonances, and more. But over your time spent researching this, like what are some of the lessons that you've gleaned, like insights that you've gathered? Because I'm new to this. You've been doing this for a while. You've had quite a lot of success with this as well. So for anyone that's like getting started, new to this, like what can you kind of tell them?
First, what you see is the planets in an alignment, and I thought the planets are the real key players here. But over time, I found that the moon is in this very subtle way, and it's very easy to overlook, probably the most important factor. Because if you look at those large earthquakes and you see the planets in multiple alignments, the clustering of alignments, like we have in the next couple of days, I always look at the position of the moon because, and these are the green peaks that you see on my SSGI graph. That's where you see the clustering of stronger earthquakes occurring, and it actually makes sense. I mean, earthquakes, they tend to occur in the stronger earthquakes, at least, they tend to occur in clusters, these sudden bursts of higher 5 and borderline 6 magnitude earthquakes in 24 to 48 hours. And they seem to align with the lunar peak. So, and it makes sense that there is an external modulator causing these sudden bursts, and the moon is the first candidate, and that's actually confirmed by my research. So I first looked at the planets, and the mistake that people make, and even if I'm quoted in mainstream media, which happens a lot, they say, yeah, he's looking at planetary alignments, and that's bogus, that's pseudoscience. And no, I do a lot more than that. It's not just the alignments, it's particularly the moon, and also not just the 0 or 180 degrees angles, the conjunctions or oppositions, but also, especially with the moon, it is the 45 and 135 degrees angles, which are also harmonics of the electromagnetic wave. So the moon is really a key player that shouldn't be overlooked.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's a variance in the lunar orbit of like 1/8 or so, going from its closest to the Earth to its furthest. Its closest is like 356,000 kilometers. Its furthest is about 406,000 kilometers. So there's a huge variation there. And we know that the tidal rhythms of the moon, it's not just ocean tides. We also get ground tides, actual vertical displacement of the Earth that creates fractures. And yeah, obviously that's going to be one of the big players. And we see these high magnitude events often cluster near full moons, new moons, but I guess also these 45 and 135 degree aspects as well. But one thing I wanted to get your thoughts on. So yeah, a lot of people talk about planetary alignments like, okay, well, we just talked about the moon gravitationally. We touched on a little bit like the electromagnetic aspects and how this is a larger electromagnetic circuit for the solar system. And that is just, we just need more information on, but it's undeniable basically. And that's the strongest force. But I mean, I was thinking earlier, we have right now Jupiter, Earth, Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars all in a perfect line. Last time that happened so nicely was 1936 with that specific arrangement at those sides of the Sun. The planets, though their gravitational forces may be insignificant, like let's say like Jupiter on Earth compared to the Sun or the Moon, it still has its own range and variance. And then if you look at the planets as a whole, they create this, you could say, third modulating factor. And I would imagine when you get an alignment like this, where you get this 6.6 year cycle with Venus and Mars on the other side, you also have Mercury nearby, and then Jupiter on the other side, that would tip that variance out of normal bounds. And who's to say that's not significant at some certain scale? Because all systems are balanced. And if the Earth, let's say, is used to that a small signal as it is, it's used to that signal only staying here, and then it does elevate by 2 or 3 times. Why can't that exert a domino sort of effect? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's early on I realized that the electromagnetic force is very significant here, much more significant than the gravitational force. It may be a combination of the two, but the electromagnetic force is definitely a key player, and this is still denied by mainstream science. They focus entirely and solely on the gravitational force. But I've seen very often, for example, with the largest earthquakes on the record in 1960 and 1964, Earth was not part of an alignment. I mean, if the gravitational force would do this, you would expect the Earth between planets, and then you have this tug from either side or anything. But that was not happening. Earth, very often, Earth is not part of the key geometry except for the moon. And the moon often makes these 45 and 135 and 90-degree angles with the outer planets. And if that converges and you have a high lunar peak, and it happens with all these big earthquakes, that is evidence of the electromagnetic force. And it looks like the moon somehow channels that to the Earth. And then you have this piezoelectric effect on Earth's crust that really destabilizes where the stress is enormous.
So that's interesting that 1960 and 1964, 1960 being the magnitude 9.5 and 64 being the 9.2, Earth is not in those geometries. And I've gone back and looked at that before as well, though I don't have those geometries like off the top of my head. So you're suggesting that there's a larger change to the electromagnetic system of the solar system when there's any sort of significant planetary geometry, and that maybe affects like a wave, like a standing wave, perhaps, like in the solar system that the Earth is then receptive to, and the moon is like pulling some of that information in.
Well, the way I see it is that we have tidal forcing with the moon, and that's huge. I mean, if you look at just the difference in the oceans, like in Paris, there can be 11, 15 meters between high and low tide. That's enormous. So it stands to reason that it also has a huge influence on Earth's crust. And what I see from my research is that the planets in their orbit around the sun and then connecting to the moon, they actually make the tides go up and down. It's fluctuating. And when with certain combinations of geometry, then you have a higher tidal forcing going on. And this is also why, for example, we see meteor tsunamis with specific planetary positions, or huge flooding like in 1953 here in the Netherlands, where Neptune played a major role in the configuration. So it seems to cause some high altitude atmospheric forcing. I read about it where they talked about primary cosmic waves and then entering Earth's atmosphere, and then we have these secondary cosmic waves, and that influences Earth's crust. There is actually a peer-reviewed scientific paper about that, which is really fascinating. But I really think that it's the tidal forcing that that fluctuates. It modulates with the movement of the planets and the moon.
With that said, I mean, we have this big alignment right now, which is not only just Jupiter, Earth, the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. We also have Saturn and Neptune in conjunction right now. What are some other planetary alignments maybe that you've identified going forward, either this year or even further out, that have like really caught your interest? Because we're often kind of going back in time looking at old ones, but I'm sure you've also gone forward in time and be like, whoa, that's a big alignment.
Yeah, sometimes I do that, and with a recent research that I did on this clustering of very dense clusters of planetary alignments, I think 6 alignments clustering within 48 hours. There are only 6 such clusters occurred in the last 25 years, and the next one will be in 2029. And interestingly, with all these dense clusters in the last 6 in the last 25 years, each one coincided with a magnitude 7 earthquake. Each one of them. And if you do the statistics on that, the p-value is extremely low, way beyond coincidence. And interestingly, no scientist is currently looking at that. They simply ignore it. But it's absolute evidence that the planets do have this influence. So yeah, in this type of research, I look into the future. But in general, I really focus on what we're going to have in the next 10 days or so, because it's quite a lot of analysis work. And I want to focus on every detail. Like we have this quintuple conjunction coming up now. I specifically look at the position of the moon when the planets reach that alignment, and that is really from the 6th to the 10th or 11th that happens. And the lunar peaks are decisive. With if you talk about earthquakes anyway.
Okay, so the outer planets and the inner planets, of course, they're making certain conjunctions, and you add that to your SSGI graph. But then you're looking at where the lunar rhythms are overlapping, and really that's kind of like your critical, most likely window.
Yeah. Yeah, the lunar geometry is absolute key. And I also look further into the future, for example, with when planets are in opposite positions, like we had last summer with Mars on one side and then Saturn and Neptune on the other. We had a magnitude 8.8. This is very, very consistent with what I've researched in the past. The most seismically active year on the record is still 1906, when Uranus and Neptune were on opposite sides of the solar system, and Earth repeatedly went between them and allowed for very critical lunar geometry to occur. And there was an 8.8 in Ecuador. There were a bunch of magnitude 8 earthquakes that year. It's very interesting to see. So from that point, you look into the future, and then you see when are Uranus and Neptune, the outermost planets, again on opposite sides in the solar system. And I think that's somewhere in 2070 or so.
Yeah, it's quite a ways out. We just had a conjunction in 93.
Yeah, but that's very consistent geometry. That, for example, before this 8.8, the largest earthquake was 8.3 in September 2015, and that was when Earth was exactly between Jupiter and Neptune, also between gas giants. And my idea, I cannot prove that, but it looks like when the fast-moving planets in the inner solar system, including Earth, but especially Mercury and Venus, when they align with the outer planets that have a very low orbital velocity, they move very slowly. That combination seems to generate huge amounts of tidal forcing or electromagnetic force. That's really significant.
Yeah, the angular velocity and momentum is an important piece of this, I feel like. And that's why, I mean, Nelson considered Mercury the activator for a few reasons. One, for solar activity, because it was so close to the sun. It's the kind of that final touch on what could happen. But it also has the highest angular velocity in the entire solar system for the planets. I mean, right now we have this interstellar object, 3I Atlas, flying through, and it's flying through faster, quite a bit faster. It's the fastest ever object observed like this. And that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that this, and Earth is bizarre because according to Hans Alvin, the original spin period of the Earth was closer to like 6 or 8 hours. And it slowed down because of the capture of the moon. And that is the standard science, whether, you know, without going into what is or isn't, you know, the moon is, we measure it moving away more and more, and the Earth is slowly spinning less and less. But you look at Jupiter, and its spin rotation around its axis is like 10 hours. It's right in that range. Saturn has a similar tilt angle to Earth, but it's also very fast like Jupiter. So these outer gas giants have very fast spins to them. Venus is like 200 something days. It's super slow. Mercury is also very slow. Mars is slow. Earth is slow. So they're far out there, but they're also spinning very quickly with a lot of mass. And that seems to be an influence.
Yeah, the combination is very interesting. And like I said, the combination with Mercury and Venus combined, Venus is an outlier. It has very low axis rotation, very slow, and I think also the other way around, if I'm not mistaken, compared to the other planets. And it also has an induced electromagnetic field, like Earth has its own electromagnetic field, but Venus gets the energy from the sun, from solar activity, and that. So Venus really receives everything, and that defines its electromagnetic field. It doesn't have a field of its own. So Venus is unique in many ways. And I've done research with Venus, and what happens very often is that with larger earthquakes like magnitude 7, 7.5, it very often happens 2, 3 days or 4 days after Venus aligned with the sun and an outer planet. This is very interesting to observe.
So there's like a little bit of a delay to a Venus alignment.
Yeah, it takes some time, I think, for the energy to actually do its work and interact with Earth's crust. And on an energetic level, the earthquake actually has already begun. And I think that's also the reason why people see lightning, earthquake lightning, so often, because that happens hours and sometimes days before an earthquake happens. So that very much ties into the electromagnetic force.
Well, and that's again, there's too many clues to discount that there's something electromagnetic happening here, because we saw, for Turkey being a great example, you saw these atmospheric anomalies, you put out the forecast, you hit it, and then now the Turkish people love you.
Yeah.
I'm in Egypt. I noticed these anomalies on the space observing system, but at that time I had less expertise than I do now. If it was me now, I'd be like, guys, this is big, because they were very anomalous. And then I'm feeling these almost like Havana-like syndrome symptoms right before and then up to the earthquake, because I started feeling unwell before the earthquake started. I went to sleep feeling a little weird. And I told the girl next to me, because I'm in a hostel, I was like, I may not be able to make this trip to Abu Simbel because we had to leave at 4 a.m. in the morning. But then I checked everything out, and it all worked out such that I was feeling my most unwell. And then we had an earthquake. I think it was a 5.5, maybe a 5.1 in San Jose on the Calaveras Fault back in 2022. This was on a full moon in October, and this was just slightly before the earthquake in Turkey. So I am researching this already, and my brother-in-law was down right near the epicenter of the earthquake, and he was with 4 of his coworkers. This is, of course, during like the COVID era, and all of a sudden, all of them became like super ill with COVID. I don't know whether it's COVID or not, but he was bedridden for 4 days. They felt the earthquake and the shaking. I'm thinking there was like some electromagnetic activation, perhaps, because there is this connection between electromagnetic energy and bacteria and viruses and more. That's a whole different subject, but it is related. There's obviously more connectivity here than you would think.
Yeah, there is. A lot happens with the energy field of the Earth, the electromagnetic field, directly related to the Moon and to the other planets. And you can also see that from reports. Biologists, for example, in 2009 reported that before a strong earthquake in Italy, I think frogs suddenly moved away, or were other animals. But there are several reports of animal behavior days or even a week before an earthquake, that they leave the region. And so the only way I think you can explain this is that they feel some kind of a fluctuation going on in Earth's magnetic field. So something has already started, but science still needs to catch up with this, I think.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, what do you think about these oarfish? They're called doomsday fish, but if you look at the record, the times I've seen it, it's like every time, baby. Like an oarfish walk may not be instantaneously, maybe it's like take a couple months, but it's crazy. 2011 at the magnitude 9.1, back with this magnitude 8.8 July 2025, we saw them washing up in the 2 months beforehand. Before the magnitude 7 December of 24th California, we saw them wash up in the shores of California. That's just 3 examples, but 2 big ones in there.
Yeah, it's. I've seen those reports as well, and sometimes it seems like nothing much happens, and it may take months. Indeed, there could be 2 reasons I can think of. There's one is a fluctuation in the magnetic field, that is somehow that they get disoriented or something, or another possibility is that gases come out out of the fissures from the seafloor, and then I don't know, affecting them, or I don't know, something influences them, and then they come up or they die. I don't know. These are the 2 possibilities, I think, but they could definitely be signs of upcoming larger earthquake, but not necessarily always, and so this makes it a bit difficult.
Can you describe this clustering that you mentioned? You said 2029, and you said when there's a clustering of 6 or more events in 48 hours, something like that.
Yeah, I've looked at the last 84 years in total, and there is statistically a 55% increase in seismic activity when such a cluster happens. These are very dense clusters, and I've developed software to calculate them, because there is no software out there like astronomy or astrology software that can actually do that. So I had to develop my own software to make these calculations. And these very dense clusters, I took an extreme, like 6 conjunctions within 48 hours, and to see if there is a notable seismic increase directly each time that they happen, because these dense clusters, they don't happen very often. Like I said, in the last 25 years, only 6 times. And in the last 84 years, maybe 26 times or so. And so they are perfect to study seismic activity in relationship to those conjunctions. And the next one indeed will be in 2029. Yeah, we'll have to wait to see what happens. It's not always a magnitude 7 earthquake. Sometimes we see an obvious increase into the mid 6 magnitude range, but definitely a seismic response. But it also very much depends on the position of the moon, because the position of the moon is always different each time when planetary alignments occur. And so, for example, in 1964, there was a full moon with the magnitude 9.2 in Alaska, and the same 40 years later, the 9.2 or 9.3 in Indonesia, also with a full moon. But it's not always with a full moon. So if you take all the full moons in the last 100 years or so, you will not see statistically a significant correlation with large earthquakes. You have to include the positions of the planets as well, and that will give you a full picture. So even with studying these very dense planetary alignment clusters, the position of the moon is always crucial or decisive.
Yeah, it seems you need to kind of just have a little bit more of an open mind here, because there's so many different factors. And if you add them together and you can kind of hold them all at once, you see how there's a larger connected, cohesive system at play. And you can start to get a little bit of a glimpse into like the inner workings of God's mind, you could say. But it's also very difficult to pin down. And I think that honestly, a field like statistics, like that mathematical study in science, may not be able to really accurately capture this. I mean, you're talking about these clustering of conjunctions. Is this all geocentric conjunctions, or?
No. It's in 2016 I developed my own software because I realized I needed a viewpoint from every angle. So I wanted a Mercury-centric view, I wanted a Venus-centric view, a geocentric, a heliocentric, every possible, even Mars-centric. And that's very important because, for example, with the largest earthquake in 1960, the 9.5, Mars, Mercury, and Uranus were in an alignment. But you won't see that if you do a heliocentric observation, which is supported by most astrology software and maybe astronomy software as well. And you won't see it in horoscopes with astrology software. So it requires a Mars or Mercury-centric observation calculation to see those alignments. This is really important. In 1964, with the 9.2 in Alaska, there was a quadruple conjunction again with Mars, Mercury, and Uranus, but joined by Venus in there. And then on the 28th of March, there was this 9.2. And again, you need a centric observation from Mars, Venus, or Mercury to see that. So that's really, really important. And so I developed the software to do that. And without the software, you cannot see all the significant geometry.
And so when you say conjunction, this is 3 planets, because we always have, of course, 2 planets doing something. So a conjunction in this case would be, let's say, Mercury, Venus, and Mars forming a line. So you're talking 3, or you're talking for this clustering, these specific examples, 6 of these 3 or more conjunctions occurring within like 48 hours.
Yeah, these dense clusters is that you have, not necessarily all 6 planets in one line, but 6 planetary alignments converging within 48 hours. And that's different every time, but they do something enormously on an electromagnetic level in the solar system. Like I said, they are really like magnets. It's a dynamo effect of each planet. They charge, they generate electromagnetic waves, and it's really like an atom, but on a cosmic scale, where you have electrons, and you can actually push an electron out of its orbit by exposing it to a certain voltage. This is well known. This is known over 100 years ago. So this is the same principle, but on a cosmic scale, and it's just that science has a hard time translating that from micro to cosmic levels.
That would make sense as it relates to Mercury, because Mercury could go and activate multiple alignments that are ready to go because it's moving so quickly. So that could be one reason why Mercury is a potential activator of these, because it can move from one to the other.
Yeah, it's not only because it's moving so fast, but if you look at the largest moon of Jupiter, it's larger, it has a larger diameter than Mercury. So Mercury is smaller than the largest moon of Jupiter, but the key here is that the mass, Mercury's mass, is about 45 times bigger than the largest moon of Jupiter. And it's the mass and its high orbital velocity combined that generates these huge amounts of energy. Mercury is like a laser in the solar system. On the plane of the ecliptic, when Mercury joins, and for example, with the Turkey earthquake in 2023, there was a full moon on the 4th and 5th of February, but also Venus in an alignment with the Sun and Jupiter, and at the same time Mercury in alignment with the Sun and Uranus. And that happened within hours. That's a combination. And it's always this combination with Mercury and Venus combined that does the triggering. This is really interesting to see.
These clusters going back, you said that for the past 25 years, all of them have a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake associated with them. And then if you're going further back, some of them have just magnitude 6 plus earthquakes, but all of them have something significant?
Most of them. I think there are 2 or 3 exceptions. There nothing much happened.
Any dates going forward beyond 2029? Because you identified that's the next big cluster. That's probably around what, a Jupiter-Saturn opposition? Should be right around when we have Jupiter-Saturn in opposition.
I think I marked something in 2032, but I can't remember. Is it some time ago when there's really obvious convergence going on? Then I stumbled upon that accidentally. Then I marked that, and that's worth saving. And then I look back, so I know that is significant. But other than that, I don't really look far into the future, except maybe for these really big, massive earthquakes like the 8.8 and magnitude 9. They seem to be related to specific Uranus cycles. It's very interesting to see as well. In 2022, I did research on the position of Uranus with the largest earthquakes on the record, like 8.8 and larger. And we can actually go back quite a bit, like I think the late 14th century. And I was able to gather quite, I don't know, 20 or 30 of them, that they know of that those big quakes actually occurred. And I noticed that Uranus, in one line with the Sun, most of the time, like 55% aligns with the constellation Leo. That's the star system Regulus in a broad sense. And these are the astronomical signs, not astrological, but the real physical astronomical signs in the sky. And so based on those Uranus cycles, I estimated back in 2022 that 2024, 2025, there could be such a large earthquake, like 8.8 or larger. And it actually happened last summer. And that was a confirmation for me that the position of Uranus is crucial with these very large earthquakes. It was a confirmation. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it's going to take a while for Uranus to get all the way to Leo, true sky, because it's 7 years per sign. And right now it's at the very beginning of Taurus.
Yeah, the end of Aries. Aries is key because Aries is a fire sign, and Sagittarius and Leo in astrology, they are fire signs. But I noticed that with all these large earthquakes, Uranus was in line with the Sun, and one of these 3 signs either conjunct or opposite. But only these 3 signs, except for 2010 and 2011, there was the end of a cycle of 3 big quakes. They were early Virgo. They just passed Leo.
Yeah, and the Earth constellations are very large. At least the Virgo and Taurus are big constellations. And yeah, there's like overlap in zones to these. But yeah, I've personally found Uranus often. It's not every time, of course, but more often than not, it participates in like a weird way with the planetary geometry, and then you get something to happen. I mean, that was the case in 2023. Is that it was Uranus in alignment, and we had the full moon as well.
Uranus is a key player.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It's if you look at this axis, it's almost 90 degrees tilted, flat on the plane of the ecliptic. It's exceptional. Maybe that has to do something with its unique influence on electromagnetic waves. That is almost 90 degrees. I mean, electromagnetic waves have this 90-degree property with the electric field and the magnetic field at 90 degrees. And based on my research on the moon with the electromagnetic harmonics like 45, 90, 135 degrees, that seemed to have huge influence. And maybe because Uranus axis is tilted more than 80 degrees, maybe that's somehow causes this influence.
Uranus
Yeah.
is the only planet that has that tilt,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's exceptional.
But they're very similar. So you're talking about Uranus and Neptune being on
Yeah.
other sides.
Well, Neptune is different, and in several ways. If you look at the mathematical blueprint of the solar system, and then you touch on the Titius and Bode law, which is very interesting. I have an article on my website. If you search for Titius or Bode, there is this article about the dynamics of the solar system and also the geometry. There's no way around it. The geometry is so specific and so significant. And if you look carefully, the asteroid belt fits a planet, the Kuiper belt fits a planet, but Neptune does not. And I once read, I don't know if it's true, but I once read that the ancients from India, they actually claim that Neptune originally did not belong to our solar system. And I can actually, uh, well, it makes a lot of sense because it doesn't. It is the only planet that doesn't fit the Titius and Bode law. All other planets do. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. But today, Neptune is definitely a key player, also with earthquakes, because I noticed that when, if we talk about 90 degrees and we talk about Venus, Venus does not like 90-degree angles. And I've seen back in 2022, I think for the first time, that I saw a magnitude 7 earthquake just after Venus made a 90-degree angle with the Earth and Neptune, and they almost always come in pairs. So you have within 3 days, you have like Earth making 90 degrees with Venus and Neptune, and then 2 days later, we have Venus making 90 degrees with Earth and Neptune. They always come in pairs, and that's a very powerful combination. The same goes for Mercury, Venus, and Uranus, where the same pairing, like Mercury making a 90-degree angles with Venus and Uranus, and the other way around, like Venus make the 90-degree angles with Mercury and Uranus, can have pretty large earthquakes. And statistically, that is a confirmation there.
Yeah, so it seems there's this interesting interconnection between the inner and the outer planets. And that's also what Nelson noticed and wrote about in his book, Cosmic Patterns. Um, I mean, the outer planets are so much further away. Neptune's at 30 astronomical units and Earth is at 1. The sun, of course, would be at 0 in this scale. So it's like a tremendous difference in distance. But there seems to be this energy connection. And then Jupiter sits in between them. Like if you look at the solar system from that perspective, Jupiter's perfectly situated to influence the inner planets and also interact with the sun, being at 5 astronomical units. But then it's also still the closest planet to Saturn, and then Neptune and Uranus. It's kind of almost a mediator in some aspects to the inner planets. Though, if it's on the other side, then that falls apart. But it is interesting that Jupiter, the biggest planet, the largest gravitational field, happens to be at like that perfect nodal boundary point between the
Yeah,
two.
I think that Jupiter has a very stabilizing factor in the solar system. Definitely.
Yeah. Have you noticed anything between Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune? Because yes, Jupiter has this maybe more of a commanding,
Hmm.
stabilizing effect, but as it relates to Uranus and Neptune, Saturn is closer to them with its orbit in general.
Yeah, well, it's a combination. It is just an interesting play
It can
between.
get closer to them, rather.
Yeah, it's an interesting play between these four planets, and I did some research on the solar cycles, which vary. There are approximately 11 years, but they vary from 9 to 14 years, and it turns out that this cycle is actually determined by the gas giants, like the Jovians. Jupiter is the most important player. It orbits less than or more than 11 years, almost 12 years, which is very close to the solar cycle. But there are variations, and they are determined by especially Uranus in particular, and to a lesser degree Saturn and Neptune.
Yeah, the Gleisberg cycle for solar activity is estimated to be like 85 to 100 years, and Uranus is at 84.
Yeah, and even if you ask AI like Grok, they actually confirm it based on established research. And Grok even admits that the solar cycles based on the gas giants is a better match or a better fit than the NASA models that only observe and study the sun's dynamics.
And that's why, again, getting back to the beginning, it's interesting. You got like basically brought into the club, you could say, where you saw the X flares, then you saw the earthquakes, and then you saw the geometry. And we see that time and time again, where it's often all three simultaneously. And I just get the sense that the planets and the sun are much more connected than we think they are. And then like light photons are traveling at the speed of light. So they can hit Earth in 8.3 minutes, or Jupiter's in less than an hour. And then the other planets, it doesn't take that long for a light flux to hit them, and how that charges them up and energizes them. And I get a sense that a lot of these shifts that may result in a big event here on Earth that literally is making the streets like undulate like this, right? I do get a sense though that the initial trigger mechanism can actually be maybe even as soft as a whisper, and it's just enough to just set into motion the sequence of events needed. Um,
Yes, these can be very subtle energies, indeed. And I like to think of the planet as I like to see the planets as communicating with each other, like they know what is coming, and then when geological changes are supposed to happen, it's all part of the stabilization, the stabilizing factor of the entire solar system. I often emphasize that. Earth is not separated. I mean, in science, they tend to look at as isolated things, and you really need to look at the bigger picture. And Earth is part of the solar system, and the other planets are. There's an interplay between them. There is a balance between them. They influence each other, and I like to think of the planets as also communicating with each other, which I think makes sense. And scientifically, you could argue that there is actually sort of an electromagnetic feedback loop from the planets back to the sun. And the same applies to the galaxy, that there is a feedback loop from the galactic center to our sun. Everything is connected.
yeah, and what do you think about I'm 100% in agreement. I mean, that's why people like my channels, because I talk about this stuff, and I think we just all just feel this. I think once you tap in, you're like, okay, I just sense that this is to some degree the truth, right? We don't know all the truth, but we just sense this greater connection, and it's resonating more and more. What do you think about, like, what are your just thoughts in general on plate tectonics and maybe some alternate ideas of plate tectonics? I mean, there's, for example, like expanding Earth hypotheses, that the Earth is just always slowly expanding. There's also the crustal displacement idea from Hapgood. I think it's Hapgood, if you're aware of that. What are some of your thoughts there?
What I do know from my studies is that Earth in the distant past, before it harbored life like we see today, was seismically extremely active and also extremely unstable. And today we are extremely lucky. Really, we are. People don't realize that, but we are extremely lucky to have this relatively big moon orbiting our planet, because the moon I see the moon as a seismic regulator or modulator almost from my studies. That's the only conclusion that we can draw. And also it helps stabilize the Earth's axis to a degree, so that the climates on Earth can be relatively stable over millions of years. But I am not convinced that the moon has always been around the Earth. At some point it was there. And also, I think it's also very interesting, is that the moon almost precisely can cover the sun disk. It needs to be at a very precise distance from the Earth to do that. And this, for me, this is all too much of a coincidence. So if you look at the plate tectonics, we have a seismically active planet. We can have large earthquakes up to magnitude 9. But if we didn't have the moon, what would actually the Earth be like? What would be the dynamics? What would be the tectonic plates? How would they act? Maybe silent for a very long time, and then suddenly magnitude 10 or so. I don't know.
I just recently read that the earthquake that occurred in South America in 1960, 9.5, that it was actually maybe stronger, like 9.8, is that the instrument stopped being able to read the values. Have you ever heard of that? I don't. This is just someone commenting online, but I was like,
if I do research now, all the resources are very stubborn and keep it at 9.5 or 9.6 at most. But if you look at what happened there, the geometry was the earthquake occurred on the 22nd, off the top of my head, and The days before, with the critical geometry, that always happens a few days earlier, there was a sudden sequence of large earthquakes. We talk about the 9.5, but a day before, there was like an 8.1, there was like a 7.1, there was like an 8.6, there was like 6.7. Yeah, there were big quakes on starting on the 20th and 21st, all there along the same fault, and then it peaked with that 9.5 when suddenly the entire fault over 1,000-kilometer stretch then ruptured. So it's not just a 9.5. Most people, even scientists, overlook that. It was a huge event. It was a huge transformation point for the entire Earth. And if you look what happened to humanity from the 1950s into the 1960s, on a social level, everything. There was a huge transformation, a huge shift on the planet starting around 1960.
I mean, I also talk about that a lot as the societal aspect as well. I don't think these planetary geometries always result in an earthquake. I think sometimes it's more like a social quake that happens. And so that speaks to it being a more of an energetic and perhaps even consciousness phenomena. But again, it's like you can't pin it down, it seems, super, super strongly with hard science and statistics. I mean, there is a lot out there, but the more comprehensive view seems to just require a bit more of an open mind to then grasp.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned that, because early on in my research, the biggest decision that I made was to prove that planets do have influence. Because if you look at history, there is this tension between astrologers who work intuitively, and on the other side, astronomers really looking at the hard facts. These are the difference between the left and the right brain parts, basically. And what needs to happen is they need to be combined also socially. So I like to see myself in the middle, trying to build a bridge between astrology and astronomy. And that's why I focus a lot on scientific methods, like building statistics. So to basically get the scientists more on board as far as they would like to go. Because intuitively we know that things work and we know that certain things are true. But the other side needs hard facts. And I think it is possible to build a bridge.
Yeah, and you also there's so many things floating around now, ideas and theories that are ungrounded and don't have anything verifiable beyond them. So there is a certain level of skepticism that's needed and to actually verify certain things, which is why I think it's really important. Like for me, for example, I'm just tracking this every single day. I'm doing my historic research, and then when we see them, I've put out a few forecasts this past 12, 13, 14 months, going before that too, but really the past year, there's been a lot of forecasts I've put out, and then they've actually hit fairly close in terms of magnitude, location, the date. The most notable being the 8.8 megaquake. I mean, I made a video 3 days before that occurred on the 29th saying this is the highest likely area that we get a high magnitude earthquake, a megaquake, in the immediate near future. And I said it could be even greater than 8.5. So there was also a little bit of the universe working through me there. But as it relates to proving these things, I think it's really important to also be able to do it, as you could say, like in the field, where it's not just historic analysis. It's can you interpret the signs right now and then provide that forecast and it actually turns out to be correct? And if so, that is like the ultimate proof in my mind that something works. Especially if you do it multiple times, then you can't deny it at that point. As a one-off, maybe, but it's been more than a one-off now for both myself and also yourself.
Yeah, it's like looking at electromagnetic energy. I mean, if you look at astrologers, they talk about energies, and at some point it should be possible to actually prove that. And I was curious enough to do the research and find out how it actually works, because it has. I mean, if you look, I'm a geometry guy. I like numbers. I even studied numerology because there is so much with numbers and geometry in the universe that. That is not fully understood, like the mechanism, things that come into creation always come into creation with in a very geometric way. There's no exception. So with earthquakes and the influence of the planets and the moon, there should be something that we can define and recognize, and to learn to recognize. And this recognition, I think, is important for both astronomers and astrologers, for everyone actually.
So what recommendation would you give to anyone that's interested in this? Because I know I personally just started up, and the way I learn best is to do the research and then also to summarize that with a video that I produce, which is turned into an educational platform. And then you started off with just, you had this curiosity and you've done very similar things. Like we've done very similar things in this regard, just you've been doing it for longer. But there's not too many people talking planetary geometry out there. Like it's pretty niche. But there's a huge amount of interest in it though. I mean, you've had videos that have gone to hundreds of thousands to million plus views. I've had the same. So there's clearly like a lot of interest there. I think some people just don't know where to start. And not everyone's going to have maybe like the brain for it, and that's fine. They can just appreciate it. Just like I'm not probably going to be Van Gogh anytime soon. But for anyone that like is feeling like I want to learn more about this. I want to like make significant strides forward in this field for the collective. What recommendations would you give to them? What advice? Like where should they start?
Well, it's a difficult question. I think if you're really interested, we have software these days that can easily visualize a solar system. That is a good starting point. I did that back in 2014. I fired up a solar system scope. It's a great tool. But I think the most important thing for people is to become aware of the bigger picture, which is the solar system. I mean, we are so caught up in daily life here on Earth that we forget about the bigger picture and the planets around us. I mean, for us, these are huge distances, but on a cosmic scale, it's just like a grain of sand. Our solar system, it's just a matter of perspective here. So I think it's very important that there is this awareness of the bigger picture, like raising the level of consciousness. And to do that, I think is really become aware of the existence of the planets, to look at the solar system and to see how the planets move, how they interact like a clock. That already raises our consciousness and raises the awareness to the bigger picture that we are, the dynamics that we are a part of.
Yeah, I guess it would hit different when you're starting to think about the planets and you're aware of this conjunction in the sky, for example, and then you get the news that some big event occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been hearing talk about this, conjunction, one in, let's say, 50 years happening right now. And then all of a sudden it really hits home because it's like a felt lived experience versus it just being an abstraction from 120 years ago or something.
Yeah, I think you will always have people who are really curious. People there needs to be a curiosity somewhere. There are also people who don't want to believe it and to really think that it is all nuts and it's pseudoscience, and they are, I wouldn't say closed-minded, but they simply are not interested. So it needs to start with a certain level of interest to get the news and to make the connection and to then start following the videos and then maybe do some research of your own.
Well, I wish everyone the best with that. We have two resources for anyone that watched this point. We have Frank's channel at SSGEOS on YouTube, and then your website is ssgeos.org, correct? And then also you're already on my channel watching this, folks. So subscribe to both and you'll stay up to date on all this, I'm sure. And yeah, Solar System Scope, I love that application. I'll link that tool also in the video description. It's Solar System Scope, and they have a free version. The paid version's also, it's like a one-time, like $15 max or something. I highly recommend it as well. We're not affiliated with them. At least I'm not affiliated with them in any way.
No, me neither, but it's cheap, It's 10 or 15 bucks something.
Yeah. So any final closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, it was great to be on the show. No, it was great. I hope that that this was educational.
Yeah, and we'll keep tracking what's happening in the sky for everybody. I'll look into 2029 and 2032. We have a Saturn-Uranus conjunction, so that's already a key date. I know we have this Jupiter-Saturn opposition in 2030 around that time because we had the conjunction in 2020. That's a 20-year cycle. So quite a lot of activity for the next few years ahead of us, as there always is, but they do seem to come in clusters as well. We just went through a big conjunction cluster because of Jupiter being so fast and hitting all the outer planets, and they're in this harmonic configuration right now. So hopefully it all works out. And thank you, Frank, for jumping on and for sharing some of your wisdom with us.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.